My name is Richard Puckett. I've been with the National Space Society for several years, and I've been involved from practically the beginning in promoting this concept.
My name is Terry Savage. I'm not actually the original author, although I'm probably the most vocal proponent at this point of this proposal. I've been a space activist since 1975, and I'm looking for this as a way to get people fired up again like they were in 1975.
I'm David Bliss. I'm the moderator here. Step in the middle, like I said. President of Inland Empire Space Group. I've been a member. I joined the L5 Society in '86. I've been interested in the subject at least since high school. It was Gerard O'Neill's articles that got me interested. And I'll pass it on.
Okay, well, for anyone who doesn't know who I am, my name is David Anderman. I got interested in this whole space activism bit in the mid-'70s when I read Gerard O'Neill's book. And, but I did not join the L5 Society until 1986. I'm president and vice president of San Diego 5 and member of the board of directors of Oasis. And I was at the October CSTC meeting where the first glimmer of this Luna 2010 resolution came to light, and I opposed it then and I oppose it now.
My name is Robert Persons. I'm at San Diego L5. I'm the political liaison and also on the policy committee. I joined L5 at National Space Institute in '86, and I'm opposed to Luna 2010.
Okay?
Yeah.
What are we here to talk about? What are we here to talk about? Here to talk about Luna 2010. Is there anyone here who's not familiar with the main points? Okay, well, I'll run down real quick then. The basic proposal is that the United States should claim the northern hemisphere of the moon as United States territory, that the United States should then develop essentially a fort on the moon and should open the moon up to homesteading by U.S. citizens or anybody else that Congress wants to let in. And if they can in fact get to the moon and survive for 6 months, they get clear title to 100 square miles of land on the moon. That's what it actually says, and as I'm sure we'll get into the details of whether that's a good or bad idea and why. Let me give you some of the history of how it came about. Dave mentioned it was at our meeting in October. Scott Beach is the actual original author of Luna 2010, and it came about as a result of an argument about the proposed architectures that came out of the Stafford Commission. And there was argument about whether architecture 3 was better or architecture 4 was better. And when Scott actually looked at it in detail, his conclusion was they both stink because they're much too slow. They don't get anything done that's really meaningful soon enough. And that sort of leads into what the underlying rationale for Luna 2010 is. And that is to have communities in space within our lifetime. And that distinction is very critical, within our lifetime. If what you want to do is follow the safest path for maybe nudging people into space as soon as is convenient, this is not the way to go. There are other more mainstream approaches that have a higher probability of making some small incremental improvement in when we move into space. If you want to do it within our lifetime, you have to take a somewhat more radical position. There is no comfortable extrapolation of existing trends or minor modification of existing plans that'll make that happen. There are no high probability solutions for getting communities in space within our natural lifetime. So the only options you have are all going to be low probability solutions. The proposed mechanism here for Luna 2010 is to tap into the sometimes underlying, sometimes not so underlying nationalism that exists in the U.S. You see it in terms of trade discussions, you see it brought up in a lot of unproductive ways. This would be a way to channel it into something useful. Basically, the U.S. would go out and claim the territory based on, and develop the territory based on the fact that the U.S. wants it for its citizens. Now, the idea is not that you're going to have, people flying to the moon by the year 2010 as cheaply as you can fly to New York now. That's not going to happen. But the only way you're going to get the area developed at all is if some people can go and have clear title to it. We're not going to go for some fuzzy international reason. We're not going to go for knowledge. Economics won't justify large numbers of people in space for a very long time because robots are getting better all the time. The only thing that's going to justify people being in space is because they want to be there. That's what this is intended to do. Get people fired up, get people interested in a new project that has some payoff to the country, if not immediately economically, at least in terms of having done something useful. The country desperately needs a frontier, or we're going to end up picking lint out of our navel and burning down our cities.
I think it's your turn.
How much time do we
Well, he took about 6 minutes, so.
Well, we're at a crossroads in the history of space development and space exploration at this point in time. A general awareness has settled upon us that the NASA route, the last 30 years, are not going to get what space activists want. That is, access to space for virtually anyone who wants to. 30 years ago, when Alan Shepard and Yuri Gagarin first flew in space, there was a lot of excitement among the masses here in the United States. It was clear to people that at some point in the future that everyone could go, just like 30 years after the Wright brothers, virtually anybody who wanted to fly in the air could get in a DC-3 and fly somewhere. Here it is 31 years later, and that promise has not come true. That when people fly in space, or Americans go into space, it's headline news, or at least in the first section of the paper, just as it was 30 years later. And every year a handful of people at a huge cost go into space. So what Terry's proposal is hoping is that by the United States claiming the moon, that somehow will spur private industry and government into allowing some route in our life, at some point in our lifetime, large numbers of people to go into space. And unfortunately, I've examined his proposal, and I can see no connection, no way that if the United States creates free private property on the moon, that's going to allow you and me to be able to fly in space or to the moon. The problem is that even if you gave away every square foot on the moon, that you and I can't afford to go there to claim that property. We may be able to look up at night and say, gee, we own that, but we're not going to be able to get there. Because right now, the fact of the matter is that a current launch cost would cost $25,000 for every pound that we send to the moon. As an illustration of that, the Soviet Union back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, spent a huge amount of money to send robot probes to the moon and to bring back soil. And they spent billions on the project, and what they brought back weighs less than this cassette player. It's an enormously expensive undertaking to get to the moon, and private property up there is not going to get us there. Furthermore, this proposal is would be very well disliked by our international friends. And at this point in time, we're spending a huge amount of money, $30 billion, to develop the Freedom Space Station in conjunction with our quote-unquote international partners. If we were to abrogate the Outer Space Treaty, in other words, completely change the legal framework of space development, space exploration, at this point, at the moment in time that we're spending the $30 billion, and the Japanese are spending billions, and the Europeans are spending billions, it would throw that whole program and the whole future of international cooperation into jeopardy. So the risks of the United States from doing this are very great. The rewards are theoretical, but they're simply not there, and they're not going to be moving into space.
I get to rebut him. I'm amazed that you have suddenly become a proponent of the space station. You have always been one of the people that is foremost saying that we should not waste our money on the space station. And yet, that's the best argument you come up with, that we need to save the space station? I think we have to think about, first of all, what are we trying to accomplish here? And what we're trying to accomplish is we want to get large amounts of people living in space. Let's keep our sight on the goal. And we want it to happen for the next 20 or 30 years, not 50, not 100 years. If we don't even try to achieve that goal, we're certainly not going to achieve it. Secondly, look at history. How have we opened up frontiers? How have we developed new communities, wherever they have been? It's always been through private property. It's often been through government helping to develop the infrastructure. And Basically, in order for it to become economic to do something, you have to develop the demand. People were not going to the West Coast until there was demand for it, until there was something useful and interesting, and there was a reason. What we need to do in order to go into space is to create a large demand. If there are large numbers of people who will pay to go to the moon, that will stimulate a demand that will help lower costs. Right now, one of the big problems is that there's a chicken and egg kind of a situation. Launch costs aren't being lowered because there's not enough demand, but the reason that there's not enough demand is because the launch costs are too high. What happened with airplanes is a good example. In airplanes, we improved the technology. With the improved technology, we're able to lower the cost. When we're able to lower the cost, we're able to improve the demand. And it was an escalating thing. So what we need to do is something very similar to what we did with the development of airplanes. We need to stimulate the demand. Stimulating demand will give an incentive for companies to try to come up with better technologies to lower the cost. With the lower cost, we will increase the demand. And that escalation will eventually bring us to a low enough launch cost that this becomes feasible. But until we start, until we try to begin to stimulate the demand, there is no incentive. Launch costs have not changed in the last 30 years. One reason is because the government is doing a very poor job of solving that problem, but also because there hasn't been enough of a demand to start the process.
All right. People arrived on our shores originally through government exploration in order to find new lands and take the territory. That was one way to do it. But the way people got out into the new lands were through private enterprise, to create companies on these new shores, or to escape political oppression. And you find individuals going out in large numbers because it's in their best interest to do so. You'll find that where people can make money, they will go, even at large risk. You'll find people going where they feel that they can make a profit, where they can claim property, where they can create wealth. You'll find that they go there. It's not necessarily through nationalism that these things get done. As David has pointed out, we cannot get there right now. We do want to go. We see the benefit of going. But we cannot get there at today's prices. However, if we find that we can claim property and exploit the property, perhaps we could create the wealth we want and create the kind of space program that we would like. We have to create private property in space and encourage free enterprise to go. I would agree with that portion of Aggregation in Space Treaty, perhaps. But sovereignty is not claimed by nations. It's claimed by individuals. And certainly not before you attempt to land and create a permanent installation. We need to have the permanent installation before we can claim sovereignty, and certainly not much more than we can see around us at the time we arrive.
We just going back and forth, is that the plan, or?
I'll let you go back and forth once each, and then we'll...
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, Richard made the good point about the supply and demand sort of chicken and egg cycle. And the supply side, the launch cost issue, is an important issue that needs to be worked. But that's fundamentally an engineering task. That's not a policy task. And the demand side is something that can be affected on a policy basis. We all seem to agree that the standard NASA path isn't going to work for much of anything useful. So, that's sort of the basis of agreement. But the question of where do you go from there, it's true that the New World was originally settled by government, but then really exploded when it was done more on a private basis, and that is exactly what we're proposing. In terms of government expenditures, what Luna 2010 proposes is that the government do basically an Architecture 4 kind of thing, but at 4 or 5 times that level of effort. Instead of having 25 people on the moon by 2010, 20 I think it is under Architecture 4, you have 100. Okay, that's within the realm of what people can believe. That is, it's not, from a technological standpoint, out of the ballpark of what's possible. And then, that in terms of expenditures, that's about all the government does, is to have that outpost where you can buy air, where you can buy water, where you could, it's sort of a fort and a trading post. The rest of the development of the moon would then take place by the privately organized groups going out and doing their thing. If I were trying to colonize, if I were Ross Perot or whoever, it's going to be done by the rich first, and I don't hide from that at all. That's absolutely true. If I were one of those folks who was going to do that, I would want to know that I had clear title to the land. Now, if you're going to buy a house, would you rather have your title enforced by the U.S. government or by the common heritage of all mankind? You know, I don't think there's a lot of mystery as to what's the stronger defense of property rights. And we need to get away from this idea, you know, that we can't get to the moon. From a technological standpoint, that's bogus. It's just a question of, again, will and money. If we wanted to put a person on the moon and bring them back, and we weren't excessively concerned about what it cost, we could do that within 5 years. Piece of cake. Particularly if you're willing to kill a few people in the meantime. Yeah, the first 2 don't come back. But 5 years from now, you get one back. Let's see, what else? I think the risks are being overblown and the benefits are being understated, but that's not surprising. Most people in the development of the United States didn't move out west, but they benefited by having a frontier. Initially, they benefited psychologically, and in the long term, they benefited materially from the presence of the frontier. And that's probably one of the most compelling reasons for doing this now.
All right, first off, the space station. Why is it I'm citing the space station? I'm a taxpayer, just like all you people are. And even though I think the space station is a bad idea, if we get to 1995, 1996, 1997, and we have just blown the $30 billion on the space station, and there's actually pieces that are up there, and then these guys convince the United States government to abrogate the U.S. treaty, and the Japanese and Europeans bail at that point, then we're all out of pocket all these billions of dollars, and we've got less than we have now. So clearly, at that point in time, you don't want to cancel it. You don't want to do something that you can jeopardize the space station. You can cancel it now. Second issue here, the demand side that we were talking about before. First off, is this effort going to stimulate the demand? As I alluded to before, simply being able to point to the moon and own 100 square miles is not going to incent you, allow you to get up there. But to begin this whole process, Terry says the United States government is going to have to establish a colony or a base on the moon of 100 people by the year 2010. I want to take a look at that to see how feasible that is in today's political, technical, and economic environment. In the 1960s, we spent $24 billion to send 12 people to the moon. As you probably know, each flight consisted of 2 astronauts landing about 10,000 pounds of payload on the surface of the moon. So we got a net of 60,000 pounds of payload. That's about equivalent of the Mir space station today. What these people are talking about is not 12 people for a day or so apiece on the moon, but rather 100 people living there indefinitely. So the 1960s cost of $24 billion can be translated today to 240 billion people to duplicate Apollo in today's dollars. But they're talking about order of magnitude, perhaps 2 orders of magnitude more effort than in the Apollo missions. They're talking again about 100 people permanently on the moon. So we're not talking about 60,000 pounds, but perhaps 600 tons, 6,000 tons of material launched from the Earth to the moon. Huge undertaking that's not going to cost $240 billion, but perhaps could cost trillions of dollars. Now, although we may agree that is a wonderful prospect that all this is going to happen, in the light of today's, the Congress of today, politicians of today, launch costs of today, the NASA of today, is that really going to happen? How many people do you think? How many people here believe that in the next 19 years, Congress is going to spend hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars to create a lunar colony? And do you believe that NASA would actually, that the Congress would actually do that?
Yes. That's more likely than that question to be developed.
If they'll do it, it's how to look down here.
Well, given that there are some additional demands and federal funding right now being evident in Los Angeles, the chance of NASA's budget being increased in the next year or 2 years by a factor of 10 is highly unlikely. Now, again, I'd like to refer everyone back to the fact that to send something like this to the moon, what does this weigh, 5 pounds, might cost well over $100,000. The chances of we being able to afford to actually get to the moon under today's launch costs are highly unlikely. So I believe that given that we have, personally, the people in this room have limited resources, it's hard to be a space activist. There's plenty of other pressing concerns. The most direct way to allow people to get into space as soon as possible is not to come up with these scenarios of claiming the moon, so we're all going to fly there as soon as possible. It's clear that the way to get into space as soon as possible is reduce the launch costs. And there's some very easy ways to do that now, as opposed to this incredibly difficult struggle to get the United States Congress to abrogate the Outer Space Treaty, endanger the Freedom Space Station, and incur the wrath of the foreign partners. And if I get a chance later on, I'll talk about how we can get as many people as possible into space as soon as possible.
Well, very interesting. Your numbers are very impressive and completely misleading. First of all, we do not have 1960 technology. When we attempt this effort, we will have 2000 technology. Our 1980s technology already will be able to make things a lot better. We have developed a lot of advanced materials for the NASA program that will enable us to do these things a lot cheaper and a lot better. So I think the trillions and trillions of dollars to do what we propose is very misleading. Also remember that the approach to the project is a bootstrap approach, similar to the things proposed by Gerard O'Neill. Set up a small pilot thing, it starts developing manufacturing capabilities. The idea is to live off the land and use as much local resources as possible. So I think from a technical standpoint, it can be done within a reasonable time frame, within a reasonable amount of money. Certainly it's going to be expensive, but government, certainly the United States government, throughout its history, has been a supporter of infrastructure, whether it developed the canals or the railroads, or helped to develop the industry for the interstates for the trucks, helped develop technology for the airplanes. It has helped develop the transportation infrastructure to expand our frontiers. And we're asking for it to take on this role again because of its importance to our economy. Bear in mind, this is not simply a bunch of guys who want to go off live on the moon, think it's fun, and there's no benefit to the United States. There's tremendous benefits to the United States to be involved. And this is not just for national prestige. There's a lot of lunar resources. We could certainly, not only we're talking about mining operations, what about solar power satellites and solar power towers, monitoring the environment, astronomy laboratories. We don't need to go into all these things. Everyone's very familiar with a lot of the benefits that can be accrued, economic benefits. The money spent, the money invested on this project will benefit many times over. There'll be a large return on investment to the country. So we're not asking them to waste lots of money that will never see any return on their investment. They will see a large return to the country for the investment made. I'd also like to try to answer 3 objections that were in the space news of the San Diego 05, if I may. Your first objection was that the United States government claiming sovereignty should not do it until you can first go back to the lunar surface. And since the U.S. currently cannot send people there, it should not have the right to claim property there. Well, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. First of all, as Terry said, we certainly can go back. We've done it the first time, we can go back again. We have the capability. It's just a question of the will. Nobody else has put flags on the moon except for us. Now, the reason we were able to claim the Northwest Territory was because we sent explorers there, and those explorers later were able to be used as a claim for sovereignty. So just as the Lewis and Clark expedition was later used to justify claiming Washington and Oregon, Neil and Aldrin can be used as justification for claiming the Northern Hemisphere. Your second objection was that if we were to do this, international cooperation in space would be jeopardized. Well, I think you've overblown, first of all, the importance of international cooperation, and second of all, I think you've overblown the damage that it would cause. Because the attitude, the whole point of this is not, we're going to do it, everybody else go away, it's solved. We want international cooperation. But the United States has to take the lead. The United States is the only country at this point that has the capacity and the ability to take the lead. Why do they need to take the lead? Because in order to develop the moon, we need to have a private property regime. And that means laws. That means a nation has to put itself in the line saying, these are the laws and regulations, and they will be enforced. That's the United States comes in, which answers your third objection, which is that why is it in the best interest of lunar development for the U.S. to put its laws? Business will not go in and invest large sums of money developing the infrastructure and the technology unless they can be sure they'll be able to get a profit. And they can't be sure they're going to get a profit unless they know what are the rules they're working under. So first we need to establish the rules of the game. Then business will know that it can make a profit. When business knows it can make a profit, it knows the rules of the game, then it becomes sensible to invest large sums of money to develop the infrastructure and the technology, which will make them piles of money and catapult us into space.
It is much more likely that free enterprise could make a profit if they were not existing under the United States laws. If they were able to establish their own laws, aside from United States laws, they could probably make much more profit, be much more able to conduct a profitable business. The tax codes and the laws and the regulations that are required by the United States are those of an earthbound system with earthbound rules that have been established over a number of years and piled on top of one another that make it very difficult to do business. I think you might find it much more easy in a smaller community on the moon to do business of a different sort than we can do here on Earth without the tax codes and regulations that are required by the Earth. What happens when the EPA gets involved on a lunar scale? What kind of codes will they make up and try to keep the spoliation of the moon, which is an airless system that has no ecosphere of its own? It would be best in some cases to avoid government interference at this level. Sovereignty should be established upon establishment of a base, perhaps within the framework of the U.S. without its laws, for legality purposes, to know that you can establish private property. And since the UN does not have sovereignty of its own at this time, perhaps the U.S. is a good alternative. But it should not be done for the United States as a whole to claim the entire northern hemisphere of the moon. I would say that is appropriate at this time. Individuals, perhaps, or corporations certainly, to claim sovereignty in the name of the U.S. as they claim a portion of the moon. David, I do believe there are a number of low-cost launch alternatives, and I think we approached a lot of those situations on our last conference. It's possible that these can be used by private corporations, mass-producing low-cost boosters to get us into space and possibly onto the moon. I think it has potential for free enterprise and small groups of people to claim property on the moon within U.S. legal rules.
Okay, I'll let you play it out a little later. I want the audience to have a chance.
Fair enough.
So anyone out there like to ask any questions?
Yeah, I would like to elaborate on the fact that, just very quickly, that we have a managerial problem at present in the United States. The problem is not going to be rectified in a short period of time. In that period of time, there are other organizations in other places that are behind us now that may not be behind us in the near future. They may be ahead of us because their operating system, man, is more efficient than ours. Now, it is my impression that an organization that does pass us by would be very irritated at the United States making claim to something they could not get to. And we may have the engineers and the scientists to create the hardware, but we do not have the political gumption, the managerial efficiency to do it right now. So I just wanted to make that comment, that is, being a member of L5, that is the way I feel about it, is that we need international cooperation. If you could take an example, the consortium may ally itself with ESA. Now, that is a very potent alliance. If that indeed does happen, we have to say that they'll get there first. Because now they have 33 missile bases instead of one that they can launch from. They can launch all kinds of different things. They've got ESA and the European industrial technology of the modern world, plus the Soviets' experience in space. So they could get there first. And I would, if I were a member of that organization, would resent the fact that these upstart United States people, they can't get there, claiming that portion of the moon. In fact, it would create friction, in my opinion. That's the end of my comment.
I don't see why this gentleman here keeps saying we can't get there. We've already got there. The flag is there.
Now.
It's ours. It doesn't make any difference. If I take and put something on that piano and go to the restroom, and you come and take it off that piano, it is mine. And what you are doing is aggression against me. The United States has already gotten there. We've claimed it. It's our flag. Now, if whoever, whatever, goes up there and takes our flag and threads over it, you know, that's an act of war.
Well, yeah, but I'm looking at it more from the point of view of in the New World Order, I think. The New World Order is less nationalized and more the world cooperating. More the world gets together and cooperates. The more we're going to have.
Yeah, say that in Yugoslavia and the Baltics.
Yeah.
But I think what you're overlooking is this the way this country was established.
Yeah, that's right.
They came over here, there was nothing over, they turned around and went back home. And then the Spaniards came over and found the gold. No, if the United States has claimed the moon, it's ours.
The thing is, we haven't claimed the moon. We went up there and at no time did the United States claim the moon. They say possession is 9/10 of the law. If we claim it and then we don't have the will or ambition to go there and someone else does, you know, it's it. I'm there and you're not.
Well, if we don't have the will or interest,
Okay, I'd like to address your point about we went to the moon, we can go back any time, and therefore it's ours. And it's true, if you put a book on that piano and you leave the room, somebody takes it, that's clearly theft. That is your property, and it's your right to get that back. In the case of the moon, not only did we leave there, but the rockets that got us there, we essentially destroyed the rockets, we destroyed the assembly lines. The engineers who built them, many of them have long since died, or left the organization, left NASA, and it's been 20 years. So yes, if you put your book on there, and then you go take your car, and you drive to the East Coast, and you wait 20 years, and then you find out that 20 years later somebody stole your book, and you want it back, well, you'd have a very poor case.
You're right, I agree with you. That's very brilliant. So all you're doing is showing us, or me, that we better hurry up and get back up there before they get there and take it from us.
That's right.
And they're going to be showering down on us. I mean, the United States, Kennedy said, talking to this gentleman, we're going to make these people mad and those people mad. Let us never fear to negotiate, and let us never negotiate out of fear. Now, the race goes to the swiftest. Now, if we don't own the moon, if we don't claim it, if we don't get there soon, someone else will.
Don't
If
forget.
I could make a comment. I envision the moon very much like what they're doing in Antarctica. The first things that are going to be done on the moon are going to be finding out what it's composed of. You know, a lot of scientific studies. Studying the interesting gravity lumps they found. A variety of different things. So there are a lot of scientific bases and stations set up, and of course, excellent polar observatories that we could get to. But the whole fact of the matter is that if everybody's doing it, per nation, the cost is going to be a lot less than if we're trying to do it, competing with somebody else. If we all learn to work together, it's going to cost us a lot less money.
well,
I'd like to
reason-
respond to that.
Go ahead.
First of all, I disagree completely with you. I think that until you have competition, the costs won't go down. Everybody all getting together and doing it is a recipe for disaster. Monopolies do not lower cost. Monopolies do not improve quality. Competition, business, free market competition, is what is necessary to lower the costs and increase the quality to the point where it has become safe and cheap enough to do this. And also, I wanted to also respond to your point. Lewis and Clark expedition was organized in 1803. They went across to check out the Louisiana Purchase. They decided to keep on going to the Pacific Ocean. But we did not use that as a basis for sovereignty until 20 years later. It wasn't until Canada was reorganized, they decided, oh gee, all of a sudden the president around in the 1820s said, well, we can use that expedition as a claim on sovereignty. We did not send those guys out and immediately start playing flags and saying, this is ours now. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
And on the Antarctica question, there's another interesting thing, which is one of the South American countries, I'm not sure which one it is, Brazil or Argentina. Argentina is actively in the process of putting families in their base, not an international cooperative base, their base in Antarctica for the express purpose of having Argentine citizens born there so that they can establish sovereignty. That's going on even as we speak. And so in that sense, I think you're right. It will be a good model for the moon with nations competing for sovereignty.
It'll start out.
And we ought to do it first.
It'll start out probably the way I'm saying, but it'll turn to eventually to that way. That way will come along eventually. But the thing is, right now, you have to jumpstart this whole thing. I mean, getting up there and doing things internationally is a way we can afford to do it to start. But once we get up there, then we all get together, okay, well, you got this, we can decide on this, and by international negotiation, we can have our different areas. But we have to get there first.
Socialism's failed. Unfortunately, centralized planning and monopolistic approaches have not proven to be work. They did not work. We have a centralized bureaucracy in NASA, and that's why nothing has changed. There's been no improvements. We need a free market, open frontier, with people competing to reduce the costs. That's the only way it becomes cost effective.
Well, I bet ESA has a very interesting little consortium, and the way they manage it.
They have been competing with us, and the competition has improved the situation.
I know, but there's also their names.
Two sides seem to disagree very strongly on the methods of going back to the moon, but I wonder if you're really that far disagreement on the space program as we now have it and how you're going to change it. Right now we're spending about, I would say, $8 to $10 billion a year on a manned space program, which is getting us very little. I think we all agree on that. The question is, how would you spend that $8 to $10 billion? It's likely we could restructure NASA under the new administrator. What would you do with that $8 to $10 billion for manned space? Would you get rid of it? Would you increase it? Probably can't increase much. What would
Let's have
you do with that
I want
money?
to hear all the panelists answer that question.
That's a good question.
Also, let you do it.
Well, what I do like to
Unless you want to.
I was ready to address that
Well,
question, but
unless you want to wait.
I'd like to see a number of small manned missions, 1 or 2 man again, like the Apollo program, with much lower cost, those like engine boosters, getting up there perhaps to a small intermediate station, but then moving on to the moon, and establishing a number of ways of getting there, different types of competing systems to get back to the moon, 1 or 2 man exploration, and back again. And leave hardware this time for a permanent man base. But you have competing systems within NASA doing the same thing at the lowest cost.
Yeah, I think we're very close. A lot of the things you seem to agree with. A lot of my proposals. I guess the main objection you have is proclaiming the entire northern half, and that this is just a U.S. nationalistic jingo thing. Those are both means to the end. The end is to get the infrastructure there. And if we have to have an international effort, if that's more likely to make it happen, and if it's just 10% of the moon instead of 50%, and that's not as important as developing the infrastructure, creating demand, and getting a free enterprise system set in place that we can make this happen. I agree with you as far as what to do with the NASA budget. Privatize as much as possible. Use the money as seed money, investing in the new technologies and encouraging the development of a launch industry that can do these technologies. We should be investing in things like NASA and SSTO. We should be spending less, the space station should be done privately. We're throwing a lot of money down a rabbit hole. Same thing, it's just the same thing with shuttle over again. It's not, government is not the organization that should be operating and developing and running hardware. It should be a research organization, to some extent, a scientific development, technology development. But certainly it should not be in the business of operating and managing things. It is not shown to be effective at that.
Are the rest of us going to answer that
Yeah,
question?
David,
Yeah, let's go.
okay.
Dave's not,
David
Dave's
is-
not going.
My next? What that is?
Going to-
Well, that's a very good question. That really comes to the heart of what we're talking about here today. First off, Richard, I need to comment on something that Richard said, because we have a real dichotomy. That the issue I raised earlier is, what good does it do claiming the moon if we can't get there? And Richard said, well, the government will develop cheaper ways of getting up to the moon, and therefore we'll be able to take advantage of it.
No, the government won't do it, that's the point.
The fact of the matter is that the government is not going to create lower launch costs to the point that we're going to be able to exploit the moon if we own it
I agree.
or fly into space. And honestly, claiming the moon is not going to create the environment that we're going to have lower launch costs. There's only one way to drop the launch costs, and that fits exactly into Randy's question. What would you do with the money that NASA spends? And I'd like to go farther than talk about the 2/3 of their budget that they spend on manned space, but rather look at the entire NASA budget. What do they do with that money? The answer is, well, the charter is to explore the solar system, and now it's to create settlements in space, colonies in space. But what I would like to see is that NASA become a research organization. You take all the money, eventually, that they spend on operations, on shuttle operations, space station operations, anything that the private sector can do better at this point is clearly inappropriate for NASA to do today. So my feeling is that if we take that money and over the next 10 years, phase it out of NASA operations into the private sector, wonderful things will happen. And I'll give you an example of that. Today, the entire commercial launch market in the United States is $500 million, 1992. So we spend $500 million in the private sector, which hopefully is reducing launch costs, and then we may spend, what, $8 billion in shuttle operations, the cost of all the launches and building shuttles and the standing army. That's to get a handful of people into space every year in NASA. I'd like to see that reverse. I'd like to see NASA spend a few $100 million in getting people, a handful of people into space, and the private sector be given perhaps $5 billion a year for launch costs. If you do that, if you increase the market for the private sector, they're eventually going to spend the money, because of the competitive process, to drop the launch costs. And again, if you make that market bigger, and you get more competitors in there servicing the market, then again you have additional competitive pressures, and after probably within 10 years or 15 years, we'll get to the point where launch costs will be down to that $200 or $300 per pound threshold that certain individuals it'll be economically viable for them to work in space. Once you start that, there are people up there that are corporations are profiting from their labor in space, then it's, at that point you've opened up the floodgates and you'll have large numbers of people in space. Now we in this room could make a significant contribution to changing the playing field so that happens. People here in this room can work on those marginal steps that Terry despises, but that will really get those launch costs down. So we have a decision. When I said at the beginning we're at a crossroads in the history of the space program, we truly are. We can devote ourselves to taking that $15 billion a year the government spends in space and funneling into something that's useful, or we can let the government pretend that they're going to go to the moon or Mars in 10 years or 20 years and let them have the $15 billion of our pockets every year that never gets us anywhere. And the decision is up to we, right now, where we're going to devote our efforts to. And personally, I feel that we have to take the former approach, that we have to encourage the private sector, not with words, but with deeds. And the deeds are give them the market and let them, not the government, develop the means to get us into space.
I've never heard one person be so right and so wrong at the same time. If I had $10 billion per year, and just say 10 because it keeps the percentages cleaner, to spend for the next, let's see, it's 18 years to the year 2010, I would take $2 billion of that every year pretty much to spend on space science missions, that kind of thing. I would do nothing in aeronautics at all. The airplane companies can deal with that. And for what I would take for 1993, let's say that I get this award this year, I'm god of the $10 billion, I will say I will give $1 billion apiece for the first 8 flags planted in the northern hemisphere by an individual human. I ain't going to tell you how to do it. I ain't going to give you a dime until you do it. And I don't care if you bring it back. But for the first 8 flags planted in the northern hemisphere by a human being, you get $1 billion. Well, that ain't going to happen for a while, so I just put that in the bank and let that grow interest while the companies are saying, $1 billion. Hey, we can find some nut who, we'll give their family $100 million. We won't bring them back, we'll just shoot them up there. Okay, second year, 1994, another $2 billion for space science. I would say, David says about 25,000 a pound to get something to the moon. Yeah, that's more or less right. I will tell to the world, we'll pay people $10,000 a pound up to the first 1,000,000 pounds that you can put on the moon. Okay, well that's going to take, and we don't care what it is. Don't care what it is. That'll cover, let's see, that's about 10 billion. Okay, so that bleeds into 1995. So they deliver water, they deliver sewage, they deliver salt, they deliver old junk cars. Don't care. For the first 1,000,000 pounds on the moon, we'll pay them $10,000 a pound. You can see where this is going. That's the way to get launch costs down. Getting technology development takes investment. People will do an investment when they believe there's a return. When you have a program like this, where you're going to colonize the moon, you're guaranteeing the return. What you do is you say, look, we'll pay you to get it there, and we won't tell you how. And numerous companies are going to compete to do that. Most of them will fail. Most of the first people that get shot up will die. But launch costs will drop through the floor. That's the way to make it happen. The point of Luna 2010 is to try to come up for a rationale that people might care about for why it matters to lower launch costs. Most people just don't care. You start saying launch costs and, thrust to weight ratios and specific impulse and all that, their eyes glaze over. I mean, you won't even make a soundbite with that. You talk about colonizing the moon and claiming it, that'll get attention. So what I would do is I'd fund space science because that's good, but I'd take the rest of it and make it a guaranteed market for delivered products on the moon. And there's no better way conceivable to get launch costs driven down than that.
Well, there's some negative parts to this too. Say we did go ahead and we abrogated the treaty and we claimed the northern hemisphere of the moon, and then somebody else gets there first. Now what? Are we gonna say get off our territory?
Of course not. We'll grant them title to a mile around where they are. And we'll say, here you are, go for it. No problem.
As a matter of fact, I'd rather have that happen. If we start a race and somebody else wins, it really doesn't matter. It's because the fact is now there's people doing stuff on the moon, and we will open the frontier. It doesn't really matter whether it's the Japanese, the Europeans, the Americans. Fundamentally, we really we've got to open the frontier. There'll be room for everybody once the frontier is open. There's plenty of stuff out throughout the solar system we can grab, we can play with, we can resources and all the things. But we've got to open the frontier first.
I bet you can do the same thing. I mean, if you're going to put up this money, like Terry says, if you do that, but you say that the guy that gets there and plants his flag, he belongs to it. You don't need to say that's our territory. Then this guy gets there, this guy gets over here, this guy gets over here. Now they get together and they organize themselves.
Well, history doesn't indicate that's the way that it usually works. The way it usually works is countries claim things for their own interests. And what I'm saying is that I want to try to change the perception of why space is important to a nationalistic reason, which historically has been more effective at motivating the expenditure of funds. I'm not trying to change the nature of the world and the way countries and people have interacted and trying to say nationalism isn't going to exist anymore. You look at what's going on in the world, I mean, that's clearly noise. There are people who were in the Beltway bubble who might believe that's true, and there are sort of old-style East Coast liberals who might believe that's true. But if you watch what's really going on in the world, nationalism is not on the decline, is not going to be on the decline, and I'd rather have a motivation that is historically effective.
2 points. One, your point, one, his point. Now, when you're going to take all this money and you're going to do this with it and do that with it, the same way that you're going to tie the money up, that's the way the government should tie it up when it gives it to you. In other words, you're going to kick out a result in such a time, or you're going to be on the chopping block.
That's right.
Okay, now, as far as nationalism being on the rise, it won't make any difference, because once they get to the moon, it'll be just like when they got to America. After they sit there for a while, they'll have a Boston Tea Party.
That might happen. That would break my heart.
That's
Oh,
That's
gee, what a
history.
shame.
It goes round and around, you know. I mean,
Guess who's going to be there? How far down the
Well, they probably end up sending the criminals like they did over here. The criminals and religious stuff, people, you know, they want freedom. People be glad to go to the moon.
Yeah, as opposed to toxic waste, I think I would much prefer to have human settlers arrive on the moon. Sure. Okay, sure. No matter even if they're socially acceptable or not. I'd like to address the idea of sovereignty again. That really is a sticking point as far as I'm concerned. The nation probably should not claim sovereignty over even a single crater until they arrive at a state. What happens if someone arrives on the moon from the United States and they happen to land because their compass went bad or whatever on the southern hemisphere? Does that mean we can't claim that portion? No. It just means that we claim the portion that they land on. And it should be the same case for anyone who arrives on the moon. It should be that portion of the land that they land upon, that they survey, should be property of the country that they come from, if that's the way that works best. I still prefer to have it belong to that person who lands there.
The individuals that would land and be working there, their corporations would dictate. They're not just going to grid it off and say you get grid 1, grid 2. They haven't had the lunar prospectors yet or anything. They'll find key areas that'll be key for astronomy, key for possible ice or water resources, keys for other minerals that are high titanium in one particular area that's the ratio so much higher than any other that they'll get a grid here of 100 square miles. It'll be for a corporation. The people that'll be up there claiming the stuff will be the people that are working there, that are they're equivalent to the mission specialists, and he's going to be there. They'll say, well, your tour is for 4 months. And he says, well, if I'm here for 2 months more, I get to claim 100 square acres, and guess who's going to be claiming for? Not me, because I'm not going to go out there and plant crops. But that'll be they figure in 70 years, that'll be an ideal spot for a Arecibo-style telescope because of its location and the consistency of the crater. That particular crater is going to be worth a bundle, or this particular dark polar area will be is high probability if there's going to be water. This is where it's going to be found. It'll be key spots. You'll be able to grid where those 100 square acres are just by the particular value of that particular area.
Real estate speculation.
And it'll be through the corporations that'll be doing it.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I've got a proposal that compromises difference.
Well, I need to turn the table on you folks. And that is, I'd like to ask you all some questions. And I think they would come to the heart of this matter. First off, for you people, assuming you could afford it, how many of you people would fly in space, orbit around the Earth? Raise your hands if you would do it. You would actually go up and fly around. Okay. All right. Second question is, supposing you could claim the moon, claim land on the moon. How many people would go to the moon if you could afford it?
I would go there to visit.
Okay, but I mean, basically the same people that would go in low Earth orbit would go to the moon. So claiming the moon itself isn't any extra incentive for you people. It's the fact that you're actually up there flying around. Now, I assume, when I said afford it, I assume it's all within our personal income, which $10,000, $100,000, at some point you can save up enough to get it. But the fact of the matter is, for you people to fly in low Earth orbit, I think the cheapest ride that you can afford right now is $10 million, and I don't think there's anybody who can afford that. So clearly the difference for you people, there is a demand. There's no issue about that. The issue is, again, it's got to be affordable for you to go. Not whether you own the acreage on the moon. The issue is, can you afford to go? And whether or not there's acreage on the moon doesn't make any difference. Now, Terry stakes the whole space program on putting $1 billion in the bank or $2 billion in the bank and letting some corporation send up some poor sucker to land on the northern hemisphere of the moon on a one-way trip. Now, just think about this for a minute. We all sat through the Challenger, where exploded and it shut down the space program for 3 years. Can you imagine the impact if we focused our space program on Terry's new direction? And we have some poor guy giving interviews, and everybody likes the guy, and he goes to the moon, and live in front of everybody, he runs out of oxygen and dies after 2 days. Now, can you imagine the impact on the space?
You're changing the rules. I had control of the budget anyway.
Well, how many people are going to say,
like it or
me
not.
next, after you see some poor guy, suffocating on the moon? The fact of the matter is,
March for the cause.
One-way trips to the moon to start this whole thing are not going to do it. What's going to do it is affordable launch costs, and I've already explained to you people what we need to do to make those launch costs affordable. It's clearly within our grasp at this point. All we have to do is make the effort to do it.
Yes, I think we both agree, I think almost everybody here agrees, What we have to do is privatize NASA because the bureaucracy is not working. So while we agree that we have to privatize NASA, open it up to free market competition, where we disagree is the expected impact of this proposal to increase the demand. I guess you're saying that what we're suggesting is irrelevant, it won't really make much difference in terms of the demand, and that the mechanism for competition is a good one, and we'll just have to wait however long it takes before it becomes affordable. And if that takes 50 years, oh well. I would disagree. But let me address another point which occurred to me. We want private property. We want to create a land rush. We want to have a homestead act. Basically what we're proposing is that people that go there and carve out a living for themselves can own land, and that will be a useful incentive, will create a demand. What if we went to the UN and we created a new UN treaty that did what we suggest, that there would be a homestead act for any individual that went there, they would now have legal title to however many acres. The companies that develop the technologies to do things would get, like the railroads, when the railroads went through and created the transcontinental railroad, they got land rights to the land nearby. So you could use the land and the resources of the moon to stimulate the demand for the companies and to stimulate the demand for the homesteaders. If you could do that all through the UN, which I don't think you can legally do, but if you could do it, I wouldn't have a problem with that. What we need to do is we need to set a legal regime allowing for private property and a legal regime that allows for the competition of a marketplace. Unfortunately, I don't think we can do that through the UN, but if we could, that would be fine. I'm not in this to say, America, love it or leave it. I'm in this to open up the frontier. So I just wanted to make that point.
It may backfire. It's like what if somebody would have claimed geosynchronous orbit and said, what if Arthur C. Clarke did that? Said, well, I proposed this and came up with the idea. Anybody that puts a satellite in geosynchronous orbit from now on is going to owe me money.
The countries on the equator tried that, actually. They were just sort of laughed out of it because they couldn't afford it.
Because they couldn't get there.
What is the need for claiming
It's a little farther than the 7-mile or 10-mile boundary.
What is the need for claiming the national sovereignty of the Northern Hemisphere?
Because to a lot of people, clear title does matter. I wanted to address that question anyway. David's sort of the master of the red herring question, so I won't try to compete with that. When it's outside the realm of what you can do anyway, yeah, it doesn't matter whether you can own it or not. I spend a fair amount of time flying around and driving around the state looking for interesting places, not just to vacation, not just to have a good time, but where I can own land. It's well established that when you can buy a piece of land, you can command a significantly higher price than if you can just lease it and use it. It's well established. A lot of people care whether they can own it. A lot of people care whether their title is clear. And that's the point of doing it in a mechanical sense, but in a larger sense, the point of claiming it is to stir interest. And the point of claiming the northern half, which is not as good as claiming the whole moon, the northern half is compromised to begin with, is that people in the U.S. could look up at the moon. Now, they won't know which half is the northern half, but that doesn't matter. They'll think they know. And they'll say, hey, this northern half is ours, by God. People in other countries will look up and say, those dirty bastard Americans, they're trying to claim the northern half of the moon. The point is that the northern half is something you can visualize. The whole moon you can visualize better, but half is something you can visualize. Sort of fuzzy territory, well, that's fine. I agree with you in the long run that individual sovereignty is a better way to approach life and social organization. That's not going to motivate the U.S. government to spend billions and billions of dollars. That's what the point of this is. It's not to define an ideal political order. I think we may be in more agreement about that. It's to motivate billions of dollars of expenditure. But again, let me at least try to compete in Dave's Red Herring League. Let's say that they come up with the thing that, good news and bad news. Good news is we found a cure for aging. Bad news is, initially, only billionaires are going to be able to buy it. Who in their right mind is going to say, don't do it? Because initially, only the billionaires can afford it, but that's the way eventually everybody can afford it. And that's the whole point here. The fact that only rich people can go first, I mean, that doesn't matter. The fact that anybody can go is what counts first. And then as, you know, more and more people do it, the costs will go down.
How did you have to pick the northern hemisphere?
It was a compromise.
It was a compromise. Originally,
What if we get there and we find the southern hemisphere better?
oh, then we change our mind. That's no problem. I don't have a problem with that. Basically, again, the whole moon was the original claim. The argument was made, I think with some merit, that that would probably be a little too inconvenient internationally. I mean, you expect to take them off a little bit, but you don't really want to completely lock them out. And the northern hemisphere was based on nothing other than the fact that we're in the northern hemisphere on the Earth. And so it sort of corresponds in people's visual image, and visual image is an important criteria here when they look at it. In fact, if I remember correctly, of the 6 landings on the moon, 3 were in the north and 3 were in the south. So we sort of more or less equal claim on the one.
Look at the moon. Where is the northern?
That's a good question. Well, no, it turns out that's not true either. If you're looking at the moon, you think about it, the terminator, the division between day and night, will always be on a north-south line. And if you look, right, if you look north and you're looking at the moon, you can see 1/2 of the north, you know, if there's a crescent, one of them will be pointing toward north and one will be pointing toward south. That's the northern hemisphere. It'd be easier with a diagram.
So it's up and down.
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of on its side as you look at it, but yeah.
If you look at the Terminator.
It's
The terminator runs north to south, just like it does.
perpendicular, it's 90 degrees perpendicular
Correct.
to
To the equator.
Yeah.
Okay, this legal deed, are you gonna have the fee simple?
Absolutely.
Then it's negotiable, right?
Oh,
You
you
can
can
take it to the bank,
yeah,
you can borrow, you can
absolutely,
give options,
absolutely.
that's it.
That's the plan. That's the whole point. That's the whole point.
I have a question. It almost seems to me like you're trying to build a swimming pool one tile at a time by selling one tile, one little piece, and you know how long it takes to build a swimming pool that way.
Well, no,
Can you
actually,
really get people interested in that small and minute piece of it?
we're actually trying to build a neighborhood one house at a time, and that is more commonly the way it actually happens.
Well, but if you're going at it, I just question whether you really interest people enough with that smaller incentive.
100 square miles, that's pretty decent size. That's 10 miles on the side. If I were Ross Perot and I didn't get elected, so I have to do something with my billions of dollars, I might send several people up and they could claim it for me. That would be fine. You get easily thousands of square miles that way.
We've got 2 questions here. First off, I want to take a very specific point here. Where did you come up with 100 square miles? Did you sit down and actually do research on how much land was required for an individual to survive, or did you just arbitrarily pull this out of your...
Made it up. A number that people could sort of, again, visualize. 100 square miles, people will first think, oh wow, that's a lot of land. Sort of you get a lot without realizing there ain't much there. And then if you think about it though, 100 square miles, 10 miles on the side, you can sort of say, oh okay, I know what 10 miles is more or less. But there was no more thought to it than that.
I would suggest then...
There's a number of cities in Los Angeles coming to Florida.
I would suggest that you do some research to establish how much land it would take for one individual to survive. Because you might get a floodgate up there and then suddenly you have lots of people dying simply because they didn't have the land to survive. Anyway, that's irrelevant. What I wanted to address here was the fact about the cultural change you have to instill in the American people in order to get something like this to go through. I mean, you are taking a very radical step, and I understand that this is exactly what you want to do. When you start claiming sovereignty of other territory and giving it to people, you might be able to bring it more home to the American people, more of an individual type thing, saying, hey, this is like the Great West, let's go out and conquer new territories and stuff like that. I agree in principle with that particular thing. However, I have reservations of taking the rest of the American culture with us, especially our burdensome tax structure. I think somebody was mentioning EPA before. I hate to get up there, go to my nice little echo home with this nice sealed thing, have somebody have the EPA come to me and say, you have radon contamination, you have to evacuate your home. That doesn't happen.
Okay, that's a real good
When you
point.
bring up sovereignty, you also bring up all the things that go along with that institution. And perhaps it should be put under a UN resolution with international law, however, with individual ownership of property under a UN.
Well, the UN would probably be worse if you look at regulations in other countries. But in my actual sort of expanded proposal, and I addressed this in the interview I did with the LA Times last year, my specific proposal would be that production and settlement on the moon would be free of taxes for 20 years and free of regulations for 50 years. And there was discussion of how much to put in the core proposal itself, and the decision was made that the core proposal really should only deal with the basic issues, and that other important questions like that will be addressed as the discussion goes on. So I agree with you that those regulations ought not be brought up. But we decided that it really wasn't appropriate to try to make a 20-page initial proposal. So no, that's certainly right.
I interject something. We are sort of straying from reality here. We need to take a step back and take a reality check on this whole thing. Terry mentioned something about H. Ross Perot being able to create his, send people to the moon, if only we passed this proposal. The fact of the matter is,
say that, but that's all
the
right.
fact of the matter is, if H. Ross Perot could truly afford to send people to the moon, even if he's a billionaire several times over, right now he has ample opportunity to do it because he can't. The NASA infrastructure will not allow you to get to the moon cheaply. Even the launch pads at the Cape, they would have to be severely modified, and all this. You'd have to create a new infrastructure. If you were planning to send people to the moon, even for a few $1 billion. Remember, it took NASA $24 billion in the '60s to do
He
it.
would have to create his own launch.
He would have to, yes, he would have to create his own launch shuttle. And if he's going to do that, why not do it in some third world country that's protected by the United States, Liberia, or some country that hasn't signed the Outer Space Treaty, or Iceland, or whatever, some rinky-dink little country, as long as the United States protects that country. And if $2 or $3 billion is going to get people to the moon, H. Ross Perot probably could afford that today. The fact of the matter is, it is not feasible for a couple $1 billion to send people to the moon. It is going to cost tens, 20s, 30 billions of dollars, I mean, at the minimum, and probably hundreds, if not trillions of dollars. Now you ask, how much land does someone need to survive on the moon? And the answer to your question is more than there is on the moon, because you need hydrogen as a basic component of life. And hydrogen is not something that you can even afford to mine on the moon to survive. There's an infinitesimal amount of hydrogen on the moon. And again, that's a major component of water. Because of that, you have to import hydrogen or water from the Earth or from the asteroids or whatever. You're going to probably need 5 to 10 kilograms. And again, each kilogram on the moon is going to cost you, $50,000, $60,000 per
It
day.
escalated, you said 25.
Per pound. You talk kilograms.
Oh, kilograms.
So it is accurate. The fact of the matter is, neither you nor I, even if we own the land, even if we had all the land on the moon, could afford to live on the moon because it just simply costs too much. All this presupposes that launch costs are cheap enough that if you hold title, then it's economically viable. And my feeling is, hey, if launch costs are cheap enough, if you do what I'm suggesting, if we reduce those launch costs, then 10 years from now, we're sitting on some space station going around the Earth that we could afford to get up there, and there are people going back and forth to the moon because they can afford to do it. Now we're saying, well, gee, now that we're on the moon, should we or should we not abrogate the Outer Space Treaty?
Hey,
and that's
right.
a minor issue.
What I'm proposing is a method to justify the investment for getting the launch costs down. I'm not arguing that that's necessary to make the whole thing viable in the long term. What I have not heard is a plausible mechanism for getting the launch costs down.
It already exists.
Oh, what's that?
It's literally there now. That's not an issue. The United
Why don't you
States.
just say it rather than make an
All right, the
assumption?
United States government, like I said, spends $10 to $15 billion, and of that, a year on space, and a good chunk of that is getting people up in space, the shuttle, and the space station, all those associated programs. And I said that a lot of that should go towards providing a market. But the other half of that is not just giving money out to commercial launch service providers, but actually creating the market. The United States government, right now, for example, has one weather satellite in geosynchronous orbit, and that weather satellite is about ready to go. And Hughes is working on the successor of that satellite, but a big component, the reason we only have one at a time or two at a time, is a money problem. Now, if we spent some of that money building more weather satellites, and some of that money for the launch service providers, clearly we would have enough weather satellites. It would be one on the West Coast, one on the Central USA, and one on the East Coast, and one for Hawaii as well. The demand is there. The need is there. The problem is we're spending so much money on getting this shuttle up every year that we can't afford it.
Okay, it seems like we're in violent agreement that we need to privatize. But let me come back to another point you raised, which was that, well, Perot could do it if he wanted to, assuming our numbers. Well, why would he want to? The moon is the common heritage of mankind. Private property is not currently allowed under the current situation. People could spend billions of dollars and put a base there. They would not own, they're entitled to it, and it could be taken away through some UN mechanism. We need to establish a private property regime to allow people to profit if they make those investments. Right now, with the common heritage stuff, there's no point in spending dime one to do anything for this.
Again, I have to go back, that if Perot could afford to go, he can set up shop in Mexico, have Mexico then do it
Right.
for a
The
few
point is
pesos.
not what people can do now. The point is trying to find something that will override the existing political inertia that says the money that's being spent on NASA gets spent in these congressional districts for these reasons, and that creates high inertia. The only way you break that kind of inertia is not with an intellectual argument. The only way you break that kind of political inertia is to get people either fired up or pissed. And this is an attempt to try to get them fired up. You know,
Pissed.
the Czech, because the other country's pissed, but the Czech scandal is getting people irritated. That may change the system. You're not going to change an entrenched political power system, which is how NASA budgeting gets determined, with intellectual arguments. You're only going to change it with a vision that people can easily attach to. And launch costs aid it. You can get launch costs down through that vision, but launch costs is not a vision that's going to catch on. It just won't.
I'd say there's a couple things. Actually, we probably could have launched last time at 10 foot there right now if we had the political and the cultural willpower to do it. Technology's there. There's no question about that. The technology is there. We can do it. However, this just doesn't work. I mean, I went downstairs, grabbed the 1990 federal income outlays. It's down here at the very bottom, after about 14 categories before it comes space, energy, and general space programs. This is about 7% of what we pay for the interest on the national debt. It kind of tells you where our priorities are. Space is not a priority. And one thing I do see good about Lunar 2010 is that it does not make space a priority. At least it's going to get some people up there saying, why is space not a priority? Because I can go out and own that. Specific question for you here. We talked briefly about fee simple ownership of land. Do you actually have to have any occupation of that land by it? Your Honor, if you don't, I can walk over to my local land agency, whip out the old book, and say, I want section 123 of tract 471. Here's the money. It's now my land. I can do with it what I please. And if that involves setting up small yield nuclear weapons, well, so be it. I may piss off the SAA, but I can do this. We also have that type of ability once the U.S. has claimed sovereignty of the Northern Hemisphere, that some company might have stupidly figured out which craters are the best for astronomical observations to say, I want that chunk right there, and give the government $20, $30 billion for it, for their later exploitation. Because one thing I do have to agree with is that we're talking about the Antarctic Treaty, and when you have the treaty, all we've had is exploration. Once the treaty expires, we've already got Chile and Peru trying to implement exploitation. I think the emphasis here is not to research the moon. We have tons of data. We still have research scientists poring over of what actually comprises the moon. We need the exploitation.
That's
And I must exactly agree that until people can say, this is my rock, I'm going to do with it exactly what I please, and you can go and take your solar regulations and stuff it. I don't think corporations or individuals will have the motivation to get either Congress to change, the government to change, the funding to change, or anybody else to change. So in that respect, I do like the proposal.
One thing is that it's funding right now for the space program is the space shuttle. It's successful. It's going to successful launches, at least in the past few years. And it's one of the things that's causing us problems in lowering launch costs. Is they want to put the shuttle up there because it works. They know it works. The space station, haven't seen anything built yet. You can't prove to someone who give you the money in Congress that it's going to work. We want to all get rid of the shuttle as quickly as possible. Yet that may destroy the whole support, at least from the people that give the money for the space program in general. How do we get the shuttle eliminated without getting rid of the space program entirely?
See, it turns out Luna 2010 doesn't require that. It could be done with shuttle launches or ALS and stage it from the space station if you want. That'd probably be sort of stupid, but it would work that way because the intent of Luna 2010 is to have the fort and the general store available so that other people who do it through more efficient mechanisms will have sort of that basis to start from. I'm not convinced we are going to make a major change in the way those decisions are made. So, I mean, we were all fantasizing earlier about what we'd do if we could, but Luna 2010 is not dependent on that happening.
Would you advocate one way or the other, canceling the shuttle program? Or get that money?
Well, again, it depends on what I have the authority to do. If all I have the authority to do is to try to tweak the system a little bit on the edges, your suggestion may be correct, that if you were able to cancel the shuttle, you wouldn't get anything in its place, and the total resources devoted to space would actually go down. If that's all you could do without being guaranteed that you could redirect those funds. So I'd be real nervous about advocating cancellation of the shuttle in the absence of another program. Now, Delta Clipper flies next year, works to beat the band. You can make a real good argument very quickly from a technological standpoint that that's a better way to go, but that hasn't happened yet.
You wait for the alternative, proven alternative?
Yes.
before you
Yes.
Cancel the existing. proven-
Given the political realities as they are. If I were God of money, I'd do it differently.
Yes,
There does need to be a number of competitive, cost-effective choices for space launch. We have encouraged other forms of space launch, methods of getting payloads into space, using alternative forms by going to the lowest bidder. They're not being implemented at this time. It's part of the NASA budget, but they're still not doing it. We're still getting payloads up in orbit on the shuttle, even though there may be other cost-effective ways of getting them up there. They just need to be used more, and they are out there. Companies have been formed to create more cost-effective forms of getting things up into space. They just need to be used. It's just a matter of encouraging NASA, and coercion may be required, to get them to use the alternative forms as opposed to the shuttle, and make the shuttle one of the alternatives as opposed to the primary way of getting to space. So it just requires enforcement of present rules.
You would still have the shuttle and not squelch these private initiatives.
Absolutely, it should be one form of competition. It's a proven track record. It can get large payloads up into space. It's something there. It has a lot more capability than other forms of rockets. It just needs to be one of the forms of competitive space launch. Or else the other alternatives should be encouraged. And if required, coercion is required, we need to get more pressure put on NASA to use the alternative forms.
All right, what do we do about the shuttle? Since that's really, according to Admiral Truly, in early 1991, congressional testimony lets look that shuttle operations comprise 2/3 of NASA's budget. That's the figure that he used. I don't know if he was right or not. That sounds like a good estimate to me. So the question is, well, what do you do about this? I mean, that's really, we're looking at $8 to $10 billion a year. You just cancel it tomorrow? The answer is no, I don't think it's practical. But I think that we as space activists should do is concentrate on tactics that are going to phase out the shuttle over time. Because the reality is that statistically, they're claiming, what, 1 in every 100 times, every 78 launches, the shuttle is going to have a major accident. So you want to conserve the shuttles you want to save them from having any sort of an accident. So what you do is, anytime there's a payload the shuttle is supposed to carry, you look and see, was it possible to translate that to an unmanned vehicle, to put it on a vehicle where people won't die if there's an engine failure, for example, catastrophic engine failure. And the case in point is TDRS-F. This is a large TRW payload that was slated to fly at the Titan IV. And recently NASA decided now they're going to put it back on the shuttle again because there were some minor modifications that would have had to have been made to put it on the Titan. My feeling is, as space activists, we should be out there emphasizing, fighting for every possible payload to go, maybe not even an Air Force launcher, but a commercial launcher. And if we do that, if we look at some of the later space station components, maybe they can be modified to fly a commercial Titan. So anytime we get that chance, we should do that. So by the turn of the century, the shuttle could be retired, and perhaps commercial carriers would have man-rated vehicles that are more economical and more available, the more people can fly on.
Yeah, let me quickly. I'd like to ask Riverside a couple of questions. We agree a lot on privatization, trying to get the shuttle out, trying to get the station out, all those other things. And we agree that we need, in order to open up the frontier, we need free markets, we need private property, we need competition. So it sounds like we agree a lot. And the main disagreement is this whole thing of nationalism. So let me ask you guys, how do you stimulate the demand to get this thing happening sooner? If our proposal, in your opinion, does not do a good job of stimulating the demand, can you come up with any other alternatives? And secondly, what time frame do you see us having a 100-person committee on space if we don't take this approach, if we do the approach that you recommend, or the approach that will happen naturally if we don't do anything?
Okay, well, I'm glad that you asked such easy questions. And those are totally appropriate, because that's the issue in front of us, is what are we going to do? I mean, if Lunar 2010 is not going to do the trick, if either people think it's ludicrous, or people think it's boring, or just not germane to their everyday lives, what is going to get us there? The problem with Lunar 2010 is, above everything else, is we activists, we're few in number, there's not many of us, and it's going to be a hard struggle to get this thing passed. You have to go to your congressman, and first you got to get past the ridicule factor, and then you got to get him in there, and you got to fight, you got to hire lawyers, and do all that, and you get out to your 1996, 1997, and the president makes some speech, and he says, well, I like this Lunar 2010, so therefore I'm instructing NASA to create a lunar base as the swift as possible time, and Congress yawns, and you get nothing. How are we actually going to get there? And the answer is, we are not going to get there on an uphill struggle. We are going to get there by taking the path of least resistance. And that is, we're going to get there by asking NASA not to spend more money, because that's not going to happen, by spending less money. Again, you get NASA out of the shuttle operations, as much as possible out of space station operations. You go to your congressman and you say, I'm not asking for more money today. If everybody in front of that congressman asks for more money, you're asking for less money. And that congressman will listen to you, if you're rational. And what you want to do is say, we're going to spend less money on launch operations, we're going to encourage the private sector by creating a market for it. It's easy to do. And if the people in this room would take that tack, major things would happen very quickly. The problem is, again, activists are very busy, don't have a lot of spare time. It's hard to get people to do the work, but fortunately, if you take this path, it's the easiest possible way of really making it happen. If you go in front of a congressman and say, well, we want to claim the moon, and we want to get NASA to spend more money to establish a lunar base, because that's what they're thinking, and that's what a lot of you people are thinking and saying, then they're just going to never see you again.
Timeline.
Timeline.
When?
Private
20 years, 50 years?
No, if you create a market, a quick market, a quick immediate market for commercial launch service, if you take the $500 million a year market now and you create a market of $5 billion a year in 2 years, or 3 years, which is eminently possible, what you make, create an order of magnitude greater size market, then what happens is you get the Boeings. That's a big enough market, they can get involved. Even if you spend $1 billion or $2 billion to ramp up production on a new vehicle, $5 billion a year is enough to do that. The private sector is infinitely faster than the public sector as far as creating new technologies, if there's a market, if there's an immediate market. So we're not talking about in the year 2010 there'll be a market.
You're creating this market how?
By
That's
taking
the catch.
$50 billion that NASA spends every year and reducing it. Go to your congressman and say, it's really appropriate only to spend $12, $13 billion, a little bit less, and you spend that more wisely. You say, NASA is going to spend a chunk of its budget creating the payloads and a chunk of its budget on paying the launch service providers. Spend
We'll
less
just sort
money.
of willy-nilly ignore the system of determining where the money's getting spent now, which goes to all the congressional districts in the country.
Again,
That's a real easy sell. You're right. No problem there.
again, hold on. Because of the fact that you're going to the congressman and you're saying you want to spend less money, then the liberal Democrats are going to love you. You go to the Republicans, you say you want to encourage, stimulate the private sector, they're going to listen to you. And believe me, I've done it, it works.
So when? 2010, 2020? When
Well
do you see
before
your
20, I
approach?
can tell you that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, you'd have with that kind of money, which is, again, you phase it in over time, infinitely easier than what we're doing now.
No. A specific year, you think the community could be done under your approach?
About half the time in Lunar 210. That it would be possible for individuals to fly in space based on their economic
If
value.
you were to wave the magic wand and have your proposal adopted this year, by the year 2000, you have 100 people.
It's not a question of my proposal. This is something that's already Ronald Reagan proposed many years ago. It's just, I'm spelling out the rationale for why he said the things he did.
We agree on how to do it. We disagree on, I don't think you can convince the government unless you have a vision or
It's
rationale.
already, the government is already convinced. I mean, we're already on the way. This is not something new. This is not an idea that I hatched last year. This is why you're stimulating the private sector in the first place. This is taking what Ronald Reagan has already said, that goods and services should be obtained from the private sector. This is already that. This is just spelling out the logical extension of where that's going. And if we really push it, instead of having the politicians talk that actually do, that's where we are.
What does your colleagues say as far as stimulating demand and what year you see the community, this 100%?
Well, again, the thing about private sector is you can't, the private sector, you can't be a state planner and look back and say, I would 10-year plan to give you space. Private sector, you don't know. There are going to be some
No,
private
but you
companies.
can guess.
I would guess half the time in Lunar 210.
So year 2000.
That's ambitious. I would say it would take a little bit longer, but I would say by 2010 we would have a number of different types of colonies by companies or private interests based upon the competitive launch that we would propose by putting operational funds that they use right now on NASA, putting them into a number of different companies, getting space launch costs down. We'll find more purposes for people to go into space, we'll get more people living in space sooner if we bring the costs down through competitive pricing.
So let me see if I understand you. We both agree that we have to privatize and open up the free market to lower launch costs. We both agree we want to have communities roughly 2010. Your approach is concentrate on lowering launch costs. You think you can convince the government to do that quickly enough that by 2010 we'll be able to do it.
If we
We're
spend less on space.
we're saying that you can't convince them to change unless you adopt this program and have a vision. Is that what we're saying?
The vision's already there, SEI is there, a number of different reasons to be in space are already there. I don't think we need to nationalize portions of the moon to do that.
Instead, I'd like to corollary on this, sort of what you were saying, Robert. I see it as the most productive part of the space would occur if companies will get there, working with this maybe allotment that they get to start to kickstart it, who get there are allowed to claim sovereignty over the area that they do. I just don't agree with the policy of claiming something when you do not have a physical presence there. That is the only thing that bothers me. Columbus came over here and planted a flag, but they did come back. And the Spanish came and they took a tremendous amount of the New World. But they were there. They had their guys, even though some of them were pirates, all over the place up there. Sir Francis Drake went up the coast. You know, and the Portuguese too. They were very, very, very potent groups of people, but they had the power to go and lay these claims. We right now, with the way we have our system set up now, cannot achieve that. And what we have to concentrate on is first things first. We got to get the system established so that we can even think about doing that. And second of all then, saying that any of you companies that are out there that can do this have the right to the property that you claim. If one company, for example, ARCO finds water on the North Pole, ARCO can sell it. ARCO, it is their property, ARCO can sell it. But I mean, if it's, you know, if it's, suppose it's a Japanese company that gets there first, you know, and we're going, hey, wait a minute, you got to pay us royalties because we claim the moon. And Japanese turn around and go, you can't, you aren't here, we are.
Who's going to give them the title? If ARCO goes up there, who's going to say you can have? Who's going to be the person? Will it be the president?
No, it shouldn't be an agreement that's made.
If you're there, you can say, who gives a damn? It's
The world.
The world, meaning the United Nations.
The world. Yes.
So you think the third world is going to let ARCO claim the moon?
Well, no, I think it has to be a united.
They'll never do it. There are countries which are determined never to do it.
Very good. Now, getting back to your point, and Ronald Reagan, voodoo economics. Now, this guy already went down and came back, and we're getting little bitty money. And you say ask for less.
NASA, they should give less. If we want to give them space, they should be given less money.
So then we go out in the private industry, and James Bond and Dr. Noel and these mad scientists trying to get to the moon. I mean, that sounds ludicrous to me, but
Those
I
same
don't know.
mad scientists were the ones who built the rockets that got the Apollo astronauts to the moon.
Yeah, and that's why all the people were killed.
Apollo?
Yeah, and well, in Project Apollo, there were 3 people that were killed early on. That's,
Not you. You're on the other side. I was talking to the friend.
oh, you're talking to him? Oh, okay.
Oh, he's on your side, huh? Yeah. I couldn't tell because, you know, every time we talk, when they talk, so I didn't really know.
You take NASA's annual budget of $15 billion and you place it as an award, just similar to the individuals that would get an award for the first person to fly across the English Channel, the first person that they had an award for so long of human-powered flight. You sit there and say, the first company, individual, whatever, that can produce a launch vehicle or capability of under $150 a pound will be awarded the $15 billion. That would be 1 year's NASA budget. NASA would be, you know, if somebody came up, a company, and said, you know, figure, well, for $8 or $9 million or $1 billion, we can develop something that might be able to do this, but NASA's never given us the go-ahead.
Well,
Here, they'd save money hand over fist overall, and let us share it with the other countries.
From a technical standpoint, that would be more effective. From a practical standpoint, what happens is, if you award contracts that way,
No, you don't award it until after it's done.
fine. If you pay for things that way, what could well happen is that companies in California and companies in Texas and companies in Arizona, for example, win the vast majority of the contracts, let's say. You get the senators from Arkansas, you get the senators from Arkansas, and you get the senators from Pennsylvania, and the senators from New York saying, why should money collected from taxpayers in my state be sent primarily to taxpayers in the other states? The reason it's done that way is because we don't have a national consensus of what it is we want to have happen. We don't have a consensus that's valuable to do that.
I'm saying if England comes up and develops it, or France, or
Germany, Japan.
yeah, I don't care what country. When the Nobel Prize doesn't go out and sit there and say, well, we're only going to give it to French people.
The Prize for crossing the Atlantic, I believe, was a
Individuals will occasionally do that. Tens of billions of dollars have never been awarded.
$25,000 for the first person to fly from New York to Paris.
Well, let's see.
That's how it's done.
See, that's what I'm saying. $15 billion might be enough to encourage something like that.
Okay. You're on the last one here. It's 3:30, so we need to start
Oh
winding
boy,
this
well, I've been taking notes all over the place. I basically agree with Terry that you need something that's going to excite people to get anything changed in the current political setup. But there are some things, little body points you might say, that I see that are. You can tell me at the talk, you want to make a joke on my back. Okay. That there seems to be this naive belief in free enterprise and corporations are going to do this, that, and then develop this new corporation, this new technology, and everything like that. When the historical precedence is that when they did have their greatest free hand, they did not innovate. They did not develop new technologies. They showed themselves to be extremely risk averse. They kept on doing the way they had been doing things for the last N years. They did not apply anything new. That was the Gilded Age, sort of between the Civil War and the turn of the century. We had the greatest, strongest, laissez-faire economics policy in this country ever, and it was not at half the time. There were
Is
not
that when we developed the electricity, the light bulb?
That was not done by major corporations. It was done by one particular inventor who's like tinkering with things. And all the other things were done by small-time individual people who put things together. The Wright brothers had a bicycle shop. They weren't owners of steel mills. They weren't owners of oil companies. And that's what you're trying to use your analogies with. You get down to socialism in the Soviet Union, it comes up a lot. And it seems bizarre to me because the Soviet Union, before it collapsed entirely, was able to put up more tons of stuff, more man hours of stuff, and you're saying that their system didn't work. They put up more than we ever did. And, you know, there's a problem here, and I think the problem is resolved by looking at, they took an attitude of long-term planning, not central planning, but long-term. And it could work for something that is very narrowly focused like a space program for a government. It didn't work on the much larger general purpose issues of running your whole country. The whole country collapsed, not their space program. The country that was supporting their space program is what collapsed in their end, not the actual internal mechanism of their space program. They were putting things up at $200 a pound, what was quoted the last meeting, the guy talked to Oasis last Saturday. And he was coming up with a design that he says could do things cheaper than that. So it's like the technologies are already there. There's just no demand for them. So you've got lots of issues to look at. There's lots of problems with things.
Okay,
I'll go ahead and cut out my more, but I'll.
yeah, well, let's wrap this up. Everyone went their last thing.
Well, we kicked off, so maybe they should start this up.
I'll be happy to wait when I close this thing.
Okay, I wanted to respond quickly to Craig. I think you made our point with what you were saying, because it's the entrepreneurs, it's the people in the garages. That's where the advances come from. The entrepreneurs cannot thrive unless you have a laissez-faire economy. It's not going to be the industrialists with the current technologies and the current companies that are going to really be the innovators. It's the entrepreneurs, and that they only thrive in a free market situation. And the reason that the Soviets were able to be so successful was simply they had an assembly line. And if they decided there was going to be a demand, they created demand for launch services, and they created a large enough demand that they were able to create an assembly line. With an assembly line, they were able to lower costs. So what we're saying is, create the demand so that assembly lines can be created so that the costs can be lowered. But beyond that, we have to have a free market, open economy that will allow entrepreneurs to innovate and create and improve. The Soviets had the same technology for 30 years. They never improved on their technology. They never lowered the costs. They never did anything other than their assembly line. They had the same technology. We need to open it up to allow the entrepreneurs to innovate and create the new companies, the new technologies, the new industries. That's only going to happen in a free market.
You're looking at a very simplistic analysis. It's not going to work. There's some more complicated.
Okay, the dream and the goal are there. The Space Exploration Initiative and Star Trek The Next Generation for long-term goals. There are people all over the country who want to see these things happen. The government is willing to pay some money out to do it. I see that's gotten some funding. Long-term, though, there's no reason to go into space because you can't own anything. You can't make money there. That's something that needs to be addressed, and perhaps we can change the space policies that we have now as far as being able to own things. We need, the means are not there. Low-cost space launch is not present in our country at this time. It's not being funded, it's not desired because we have government programs to send things up into space. If we were to create more competition to drive the costs down, use some of the technology even the Soviets had, buy some of their rockets as opposed to using all of ours, we might get more things done. So we need to create a means. And I really don't think we need to have nationalism within the entire moon, creating a nationalized portion of the moon to create a dream. I think the dream is over there. So I don't think sovereignty is really required in this case.
The main issues that are keeping us from having communities in space are not technical issues. And we are certainly not going to build any great public support or clamor for space on the basis of technical issues. The issues we need to address are issues of motivations and will and inspiration, and that's what this proposal is all about.
Okay. I think it's time to close this down.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.